Rain drummed a frantic, hollow rhythm against the corrugated roof of the warehouse. Nora sat in the center of the concrete floor, her wrists aching against the bite of thick plastic zip ties. She didn't look at the two armed men flanking the heavy steel doors. She looked at the man sitting across from her, methodically eating cold takeout noodles under a buzzing fluorescent bulb. When he finally set the chopsticks down, he didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just leaned forward, slid a diamond ring across the metal table, and handed her a death sentence. The smell of stale cigarette smoke and industrial bleach was giving Nora a migraine. It was a specific, nauseating combination that clung to the walls of the back office of the Southside laundromat. Outside, the rhythmic sloshing of industrial washing machines vibrated through the floorboards. Inside, the silence was suffocating. Nora shifted in the hard plastic chair. The zip ties on her wrists were too tight, cutting off the circulation to her fingers. Her thumbs were going numb. She focused on that sensation. Numbness was better than the rising, acidic panic in her throat. Her brother Leo was a ghost. He had been a ghost for 3 weeks, ever since he skimmed $200,000 from a low-level collection route and vanished into the wind. Nora hadn't seen a dime of it. She worked 50-hour weeks as an emergency room triage nurse, patching up the city's collateral damage, living in a 1-bedroom apartment with a radiator that hissed like a dying animal. Leo left her holding the bag. He always did. But this time, the bag belonged to Valenti Hayes. The door opened. The heavy steel groaned on unoiled hinges. Valenti Hayes didn't look like the monsters on the evening news. He didn't wear flashy jewelry, and he didn't swagger. He was a man in his late 30s, wearing a charcoal suit that looked expensive but worn, like he'd slept in it. His dark hair was neatly cut but slightly unkempt at the front, pushed back by tired hands. He carried a stack of manila folders and a cup of black coffee in a styrofoam cup. He looked like a weary junior partner at a failing law firm. But when he stepped over the threshold, the 2 men standing guard against the cinder block wall instantly straightened their spines. They stopped breathing heavily. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, the casual brutality of the guards evaporating into rigid obedience. Valenti sat across from her at the battered metal folding table. He set the coffee down. He opened the top folder. "Nora Fisher," he said. His voice was a low baritone, rough around the edges like gravel dragging over wood. He didn't look up from the paper. 28. Triage nurse at St. Jude's. No criminal record. Credit score of 620. $4,000 in a savings account. And a brother who thinks he's much smarter than he actually is. "I don't know where he is." Nora's voice cracked. She swallowed hard, hating the weakness in it. "I haven't spoken to Leo since Thanksgiving. You can check my phone records. You can check my apartment. I have nothing." Valenti finally looked at her. His eyes were a flat, washed-out gray. They held no malice, which somehow made him infinitely more terrifying. Malice meant emotion. Valenti looked at her like she was a math problem he was tired of solving. "I know you don't have the money, Nora. If you had the money, you wouldn't be wearing shoes with duct tape on the soles." He took a slow sip of his coffee. "Leo took my money, but more importantly, he took my patience. My associates believe we should make an example of you. A loud, messy example. They believe it sends a message about accountability." Nora's breath hitched. She forced herself to keep her chin level. "I am not my brother. Killing me won't get you your money back. It just makes you a murderer." "I'm already a murderer," Valenti said, his tone conversational. "That's a matter of public record, despite what the district attorney failed to prove. But you're right. Killing you is bad business. It draws cops. It draws federal heat. I don't need heat right now. I need stability." He closed the folder. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant, muffled thud of the washing machines. Nora felt like a bug pinned under glass. "I have a proposition for you," Valenti said. "A proposition." "A transaction," he corrected. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He tossed it onto the table. It landed with a soft, heavy thud next to his coffee. "I need a wife." Nora stared at the box. The buzzing of the overhead fluorescent light seemed to grow louder. "You want me to marry you?" She laughed, a short, hysterical sound that scraped her throat. "Is this a joke? Is this how you torture people before you shoot them?" "I don't make jokes, and I don't torture people unless it's strictly necessary." Valenti leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. 2 weeks ago, my older brother and his wife were killed in a car accident on the interstate. Drunk driver, tragic. They left behind a 5-year-old boy. Colin. Nora stopped laughing. The flat gray in his eyes hadn't changed, but there was a tightness around his jaw that hadn't been there before. "The state," Valenti continued, his voice dropping a fraction of an inch, "is currently trying to put Colin into the foster system. Family Services took one look at my file, the acquittals, the surveillance reports, the nature of my associates, and decided an unmarried man with my reputation is not a suitable guardian for an orphaned child." He tapped a finger against the velvet box. "My lawyers tell me a judge might be swayed if I can present a stable domestic environment. A sudden, quiet marriage to a respectable woman with a spotless background. A woman who works in healthcare. A woman who saves lives for a living. It blunts my edges. It makes me look like a man trying to build a family, not a syndicate. You want to use me as a prop for a custody battle. I want to hire you for a role," Valenti said. "You marry me. We pass the home study. We convince the social workers and the judge that Colin belongs with his blood. In exchange, I wipe Leo's debt clean. You stop looking over your shoulder. You get out from under his mess." Nora looked at the small box. A fake marriage. It was insane. It was the stuff of cheap soap operas. But the men standing by the door with holstered weapons were real. The cold, damp air of the laundromat back room was real. "How long?" she asked, her voice trembling. 2 years, 3 max, until the adoption is ironclad and the state stops doing unannounced drop-ins. Then we file for a quiet, irreconcilable divorce. You walk away with a clean slate and enough money to buy a house that doesn't have a hissing radiator." Nora closed her eyes. She thought of Leo, probably bleeding out in a ditch somewhere, or shivering in a motel room waiting for the door to be kicked in. She thought of her own life, the endless shifts, the crushing fatigue, the constant, suffocating fear that had been her companion since the day she found out what her brother had done. 3 years. She could play a role for 3 years to survive. "Okay," Nora breathed. She opened her eyes. "Okay, I'll do it. I'll marry you." Valenti didn't smile. He didn't look relieved. He just reached into his jacket again and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it across the table alongside a cheap plastic pen. "Good," he said softly. "But before we begin, there is one condition." "What condition?" Nora asked, her eyes darting from the paper to Valenti's face. The document was dense with legal jargon, typed in a small, unforgiving font. "A marriage of convenience is a liability," Valenti said, interlacing his fingers. "Liabilities are dangerous. If you are my wife, you will live in my house. You will sit at my table. You will hear things, see things, and know people that the federal government would pay millions of dollars to learn about." "I don't care about your business," Nora said quickly. "I won't ask questions." "You won't have to. The knowledge will bleed into you by proximity." Valenti tilted his head. "If things get difficult, if a rival crew takes a shot at my car, or if the FBI raids the house at 3 in the morning, human nature dictates you will panic. You will look for an exit. You will consider making a deal. You will realize that being Valenti Hayes's fake wife makes you a very valuable witness." Nora swallowed. "I wouldn't." "You would. Anyone with a pulse would." Valenti picked up the pen and rolled it between his fingers. "So, I need insurance. I need to know that you are fully, completely anchored to this arrangement. I need to know that running away isn't just difficult for you, but categorically impossible." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you don't just take my last name, Nora. You give up yours." He stopped rolling the pen and held it out to her. "The condition is this: Nora Fisher dies tomorrow." The words hung in the stale air. The rhythmic hum of the washing machines suddenly felt deafening. "Dies?" she whispered. "Legally. Practically," Valenti said, his voice entirely devoid of inflection. "Tomorrow night, your car will be found abandoned on the edge of the Tobin Bridge. A suicide note will be mailed to your landlord. We will falsify dental records and plant them on an unidentifiable Jane Doe that currently resides in a morgue controlled by one of my associates. The body will be cremated before anyone can ask too many questions." Nora's lungs felt tight. She couldn't draw a full breath. The room was spinning slightly. "You want me to fake my death?" "I want you to erase yourself. You will become Claire. You will have a new social security number, a new driver's license, a new background." Claire grew up in foster care in Oregon. She has no siblings, she has no ties, and she met me 6 months ago in a coffee shop. "I can't do that. I have a life. I have friends at the hospital." "You have work acquaintances who will mourn you for a week and then cover your shifts," Valenti interrupted, his tone brutally clinical. "You have a brother who sold you out for a fraction of what he owes me. You have no parents. You have no significant other. Your life is entirely disposable, Nora. That is why you are perfect for this." The sheer callous truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. He wasn't insulting her. He was stating facts. Her life was a series of empty rooms and exhausting shifts, but it was hers. "If I'm dead," Nora stammered, trying to find a hole in his terrifying logic. "If Nora Fisher is dead, I can never go back, even after the 3 years. Even after the divorce." "That is exactly the point," Valenti said. "You can never go back to being Nora. You will have to build a new life as Claire, with the money I give you. But if you ever try to contact Leo, if you ever reach out to an old friend, if you ever step foot in St. Jude's Hospital again, the fraud will be exposed." He leaned in closer. The smell of his coffee and the faint scent of sandalwood finally overpowered the bleach. Faking a death, forging medical records, defrauding the state. These are federal crimes. If you are discovered, you won't just ruin me. You will go to federal prison for a decade. I am making you a co-conspirator. I am tying the noose around both our necks, so I know you will never kick the chair out from under us." Nora stared at the pen he was holding out to her. Her hands were shaking violently now, the zip ties cutting deep red grooves into her skin. He was locking her in a cage and making her swallow the key. It wasn't a fake marriage. It was a hostage situation wrapped in legal documentation. If she signed, she would cease to exist. She would never walk down her street again. She would never hear her real name spoken aloud. "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. Valenti sat back. He didn't gesture to the armed men. He didn't need to. "If you refuse, you walk out that door right now," Valenti said softly. "But Leo dies before midnight, and you will spend the rest of your natural life paying off his debt, one broken bone at a time." It was a choice between a slow, agonizing death in the real world or becoming a living ghost in his. Nora looked at the velvet box. She looked at the contract. She thought of her brother, stupid, reckless Leo, who had ruined her life and wasn't even here to watch the ashes scatter. "Cut my hands free," Nora said. Valenti gave a minute nod to the guard on the left. The man stepped forward, produced a switchblade, and sliced the heavy plastic ties in one fluid motion. Nora rubbed her raw wrists, the blood rushing back into her fingers with painful prickles. She picked up the pen. Her hand shook so badly she had to grip her right wrist with her left hand just to steady it. She pressed the ink to the paper. She signed Nora Fisher for the last time in her life. Valenti took the paper, folded it neatly, and placed it inside his jacket. He stood up, towering over the small metal table. "Get up, Claire," he said. "We have a funeral to plan." The transition was not a dramatic, cinematic affair. It was quiet, bureaucratic, and agonizingly thorough. Within 48 hours, Nora watched her own existence get packed into cardboard boxes and shoved into an incinerator. She was moved from her drafty apartment to a secure, windowless room in the basement of a boutique hotel owned by the syndicate. A man with wire-rimmed glasses and breath that smelled of peppermint took her fingerprints, photographed her retinas, and handed her a fresh driver's license. Claire Hayes. The name felt heavy, a foreign object in her mouth. She spent hours memorizing her new history. She was from Portland. She liked hiking. Her parents died when she was young. She met Valenti at a charity gala, not a coffee shop. The story had been refined to explain why a man like him would notice someone like her. On the third day, a woman with a severe bob came to dye Nora's hair. The mousy brown was stripped away, replaced by a deep, striking auburn. Her natural curls were chemically straightened into sleek, wealthy submission. When Nora looked in the mirror, the tired triage nurse was gone. Staring back was a stranger with hollow eyes and expensive clothes. On the fourth day, she stood on a bridge. It was 2 a.m. A cold wind whipped off the black water of the harbor. Valenti stood beside her, the collar of his wool coat turned up against the chill. A tow truck, driven by a man who hadn't spoken a single word, had just unloaded Nora's beat-up Honda Civic onto the shoulder. "Leave your purse on the passenger seat," Valenti instructed, his voice cutting through the wind. "Leave the keys in the ignition. Keep the door unlocked." Nora did as she was told. She looked at the steering wheel, worn smooth by her hands over the past 8 years. She remembered driving Leo to rehab in this car. She remembered crying in it after a grueling 12-hour shift when she lost a patient. It wasn't just a car. It was a time capsule of her meager, difficult, authentic life. She stepped back. A heavy, suffocating grief settled in her chest. She wasn't just faking a death. She was mourning herself. Valenti stepped forward and opened the driver's side door. He took a small, folded piece of paper from his pocket and placed it delicately on the dashboard. The suicide note, forged by a professional who had studied a decade's worth of her grocery lists and nursing charts. "It's done," Valenti said, closing the door. He placed a hand on the small of her back. His touch was firm, impersonal, pushing her toward the waiting black SUV. "Don't look back." She didn't. They were married the following afternoon at a courthouse outside city limits. There were no flowers. There was no music. The only witnesses were Arthur, Valenti's stoic, heavily scarred right-hand man, and a clerk who looked like he'd been bribed extensively to ignore the expedited paperwork. Valenti wore a tailored black suit. Nora, Claire, wore a modest ivory dress that cost more than she had made in a year at the hospital. When the judge asked if they took each other, Valenti said, "I do," with the same flat, businesslike tone he used to discuss ledgers. When it was Nora's turn, the words caught in her throat. She looked at Valenti. His gray eyes were fixed on her, an unspoken warning simmering just beneath the surface. "I do," she whispered. He slid the diamond ring onto her finger. It was cold, heavy, and perfectly sized. It felt like a handcuff. The Hayes compound was located 20 miles outside the city, hidden behind wrought iron gates and a dense line of ancient oak trees. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress. Security cameras blinked from the eaves. Men in dark jackets patrolled the perimeter with dogs that didn't bark, only watched. Inside, the house was vast, silent, and aggressively modern. Expanses of white marble, glass walls, and dark wood. It looked like a museum where nobody was allowed to touch the exhibits. Valenti led her through the expansive foyer, his dress shoes clicking sharply on the stone floor. "Your bedroom is on the east wing," he said, not looking back. "Mine is on the west. You have a private bathroom, a walk-in closet, and a balcony. Do not go on the balcony after sunset without notifying Arthur first. The perimeter sensors are active, and the guards are instructed to shoot unidentified figures." Nora stopped walking. The reality of the violence surrounding this man, this house, hit her anew. "You have armed guards outside my bedroom." Valenti paused, turning to face her. "I have armed guards outside every bedroom, Claire. This is the life you signed up for. Safety requires vigilance." "I signed up to pretend to be a mother to your nephew," she snapped, a sudden spark of anger breaking through her shock. "Where is he anyway? I haven't even seen this kid I'm supposed to be saving." A shadow passed over Valenti's face. The cool, detached facade cracked just for a millimeter, revealing something exhausted and profoundly sad underneath. "Colin is upstairs. He doesn't sleep well," Valenti said quietly. "He was in the car when the drunk driver hit them. He watched his mother bleed to death before the paramedics arrived. He hasn't spoken a word since that night." Nora's anger vanished, replaced instantly by the ingrained instincts of a nurse. "He's mute, trauma-induced?" "Yes." Valenti turned away, rubbing the back of his neck. The state social workers see a traumatized, silent child living with a known criminal. They see an abused boy. I need them to see a mother who can fix him. Can you fix him? Nora looked at the broad shoulders of the cartel boss. He was a ruthless, calculating man who had forced her to erase her own existence. But in that moment, he sounded like every desperate relative she had ever encountered in the emergency room waiting area, pleading for a miracle from a woman in scrubs. I don't know, Nora said honestly, but I can try. Valenti nodded once. Good, because the first home study visit is on Monday. If we fail, they take him. And if they take him... He let the sentence hang, heavy and lethal, in the vast, empty hallway. He didn't finish the threat. He just walked away, his footsteps echoing into the West Wing, leaving the ghost of Nora Fisher standing alone in the cold marble foyer, wearing a diamond ring and a dead woman's face. The sunlight in the Hayes compound didn't feel like morning. It felt filtered, sterilized by the bulletproof glass before it ever touched the floor. Nora. She had to stop thinking of herself as Nora. The internal correction was a sharp mental rubber band snap against her wrist. Claire found the boy's room at the end of the east corridor. A man in a dark suit stood beside the heavy oak door. He didn't look at her, didn't nod. He just stepped back, allowing her to turn the brass handle. The bedroom looked like a catalog display for a wealthy, unimaginative child. It was massive, painted a muted slate blue, filled with expensive educational toys still neatly arranged on low shelves. A massive train set dominated the center rug. It was entirely untouched. Colin sat in the window seat. He was small for 5, his shoulders hunched inward, like a turtle trying to retreat into a shell that wasn't there. He had his uncle's dark hair, but his eyes, staring blankly out at the manicured, heavily patrolled lawn, were a soft, watery brown. He wore gray sweatpants and a blue t-shirt that hung slightly loose on his frame. Claire didn't announce herself. She knew the golden rule of the pediatric ward. Never corner a frightened animal, and never demand attention from a traumatized child. She walked past him, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. She sat cross-legged on the thick wool rug near the train set. She didn't look at him. She picked up a wooden locomotive, turning it over in her hands, feeling the smooth, polished edges. Then she picked up a piece of curved track and clicked it into a straight piece. Snap! The sound was loud in the cavernous, silent room. She waited. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Colin flinch slightly, his gaze shifting from the window to the floor. She attached another piece. Snap! Then another. For 20 minutes, Claire built a track. She didn't try to make it elegant. She built a simple, winding loop that snaked around a stack of unread picture books. When it was finished, she placed the locomotive on the rails and gave it a gentle push. It rolled halfway around the loop and stopped. She pulled her knees up to her chest, resting her chin on them, and watched the stationary train. 5 minutes passed. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant. Then there was a soft rustle of fabric. Small socked feet padded across the hardwood border of the room, stopping at the edge of the rug. Claire didn't turn her head. She kept her eyes on the wooden train. Colin sank to his knees across from her. Up close, the dark circles under his eyes were bruised and purple. He looked hollowed out, a ghost haunting his own small body. He reached out with a trembling hand and touched the roof of the wooden locomotive. He didn't push it. He just kept his finger there, grounding himself to the solid object. "My dad had a train like this," Claire said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, pitched low and steady. She didn't use the fabricated Portland backstory. She used a real memory, one of the few good ones she had left. "He built it on a piece of plywood in the garage. It smelled like oil and sawdust. He let me paint the little plastic trees." Colin didn't look at her, but his fingers stopped trembling. "You don't have to talk to me," she continued softly. "I'm just going to sit here for a while. If you want to push the train, you can. If you want me to go away, just point at the door." Colin stared at the locomotive. Slowly, his small hand curled around the wooden cab. He pushed it forward. It glided over the wooden joints with a quiet, rhythmic clatter. From the doorway, a floorboard creaked. Claire glanced up. Valenti stood in the threshold. He had traded his suit for a dark Henley shirt and slacks, the casual clothing making his broad, muscular frame look even more imposing. His gray eyes were locked on Colin. There was a raw, unprotected hunger in his expression, a desperate need for the boy to be okay, warring with the absolute knowledge that he was the wrong man to fix him. When Valenti's gaze shifted to Claire, the vulnerability snapped shut behind a steel vault. He gave her a short, sharp nod, turned, and disappeared down the hall. Colin pushed the train again. Claire let out a slow breath, the reality of her situation settling deep into her bones. She wasn't just surviving Valenti Hayes anymore. She was tethered to this broken, silent boy. And God help her, she actually wanted to stay on the rug. Monday morning arrived with the sterile tension of an impending surgery. The compound had been scrubbed of anything that even vaguely resembled organized crime. The armed perimeter guards had been pulled back behind the tree line, invisible from the driveway. The heavy steel vault in Valenti's study was concealed behind a false bookshelf. Even Arthur, whose resting expression usually promised blunt force trauma, was wearing a soft beige cardigan over a button-down shirt, looking remarkably like a stern but kindly groundskeeper. At precisely 9 a.m., the doorbell chimed. "Showtime," Valenti murmured. He stood by the kitchen island, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. He looked at Claire. "Remember, we met at the charity gala for St. Jude's. We bonded over a mutual disdain for the catering." "I know the script, Valenti," Claire said, smoothing the front of her modest pale blue dress. Her stomach was twisting into agonizing knots. "Don't let her rattle you. Social workers look for cracks in the foundation. Be concrete." He stepped closer, his hand briefly touching the small of her back. It was meant to look like an affectionate, husbandly gesture, but his fingers were cold and rigid. "Open the door." Ms. Gable was a woman in her late 50s with sharp, analytical eyes behind thick tortoiseshell glasses. She wore a sensible gray suit and carried an oversized leather tote bag that looked heavy enough to contain an anvil. She didn't smile when Valenti introduced himself, and her eyes flicked over Claire with the clinical precision of a coroner inspecting a body. "Mrs. Hayes," Gable said, her voice dry and perfectly measured. "Congratulations on the recent nuptials. A bit sudden, wasn't it?" "When you know, you know," Claire said, offering a practiced, gentle smile. "Valenti was exactly what I didn't know I was looking for." "Please, come in. Can I get you coffee? Tea?" "Water is fine," Gable said, stepping into the massive foyer. She looked up at the vaulted ceiling, her expression unreadable. "You have a very large, very secure home, Mr. Hayes, for a man in the logistics and import business," as your file states. I value my privacy, Ms. Gable, Valenti replied smoothly, and I value the safety of my family. They moved into the living room. It was a brutal hour of passive-aggressive interrogation. Gable probed the timeline of their relationship, asking for specifics about dates, about Claire's background in Oregon, about her non-existent family. Claire lied through her teeth, her pulse hammering against her throat, anchoring herself to the memorized dossier Valenti had provided. She played the part of the devoted, slightly naive new wife flawlessly. Then, Gable set her notebook down. I'd like to see Colin now. Valenti's jaw tightened. He's in his playroom, but I must warn you, Ms. Gable, he is highly sensitive to strangers. I am well aware of childhood trauma, Mr. Hayes, Gable said sharply, standing up. Lead the way. Colin was sitting on the floor of the playroom, drawing on a large pad of paper with a black crayon. When the heavy door opened, his shoulders instantly hitched up to his ears. He dropped the crayon and shrank back against the wall, his eyes darting frantically between the three adults. Hello, Colin, Gable said, her voice dropping into a register that was supposed to be soothing but sounded distinctly forced. She stepped forward, kneeling awkwardly on the rug. She reached into her tote bag. I brought you a book. Do you like books about dinosaurs? Colin didn't move. He stared at the bright, cartoonish book Gable was holding out. His breathing became shallow and rapid. His small chest heaved. He began to rock slightly, back and forth, the back of his head thumping softly against the drywall. Thump, thump, thump. Colin, Gable pressed, moving a few inches closer, extending her hand. It's okay. You can take it. Ms. Gable, Valenti warned, stepping forward, a dark, dangerous undertone bleeding into his voice. I have it, Claire said. The words cracked like a whip across the room. She didn't look at Valenti. She didn't look at the social worker. She walked directly past Gable, ignoring the woman entirely, and sat on the floor, about 4 feet away from Colin. She turned her body sideways, avoiding direct eye contact with the boy. Colin, Claire said softly, using the exact same tone she used to talk down manic patients in the ER. You don't have to look at the book. You don't have to take it. The rocking slowed. Thump, thump. It's just a book, Claire continued, picking up the black crayon he had dropped. She started drawing a slow, messy circle on the paper. I think the dinosaur on the cover looks a little silly anyway. He has too many teeth. Colin's eyes flicked from Gable to the crayon in Claire's hand. The panicked, rapid breathing began to settle into a more regular rhythm. Claire turned her head, fixing Ms. Gable with a stare that was pure, unfiltered ice. Ms. Gable, I appreciate your intentions, but cornering him with an object demands a response he is currently incapable of giving. Please step back. Give him air. Gable blinked, taken aback by the sudden, authoritative shift in the quiet, accommodating wife she had been interviewing for the last hour. She looked at Valenti, who was watching Claire with an expression of intense, quiet calculation. Slowly, Gable stood up and took 3 steps backward. Thank you, Claire said softly. She didn't look at Gable again. She pushed the pad of paper and the crayon a few inches toward Colin. I'm going to leave this here. We're going to go back downstairs now. She stood up, her movements fluid and calm, and walked out of the room. Valenti and the social worker followed. Downstairs, by the front door, Gable zipped her tote bag closed. She looked at Claire, her cynical gaze softening by a fraction of a millimeter. Your file said you have a background in nursing, Mrs. Hayes. Triage, was it? Yes, Claire said, keeping her chin level. I'm accustomed to crisis. It shows. Gable looked at Valenti. Your environment is unconventional, Mr. Hayes. Your background is deeply concerning. But that boy requires immediate, specialized, and fiercely protective stability. She looked back at Claire. He seems to have found a sliver of it. I will recommend that the temporary custody arrangement remains in place, pending a secondary review in 3 months. Valenti didn't smile. Thank you, Ms. Gable. When the heavy oak door finally closed, the lock clicking firmly into place, Claire let out a long, ragged exhale. Her knees suddenly felt like water. She leaned back against the wall, closing her eyes. You stepped out of character, Valenti said. His voice was low, echoing slightly in the vast foyer. Claire opened her eyes. He was standing close to her, too close. She could smell the faint trace of gunpowder and sandalwood on his clothes. I did what I had to do, she snapped, the adrenaline crash making her irritable. She was pushing him into a panic attack. I'm a nurse, Valenti. I don't care about your script when a child is hyperventilating. I'm not reprimanding you, Valenti said softly. He reached out, his knuckles grazing the fabric of her sleeve. It was the first time he had touched her when they weren't performing for an audience. I'm thanking you. You fought for him. I fought for my own survival. If he gets taken away, my deal with you falls apart. Valenti tilted his head, his gray eyes stripping away her defensive lie with effortless precision. You can tell yourself that, Claire, but we both know the truth. You care about the boy, which makes you an excellent mother. He stepped back, the cold, businesslike veneer sliding back into place. And an even greater liability. The illusion of domesticity lasted exactly 3 weeks. It was 2:15 a.m. on a Thursday when the reality of Valenti's world kicked the front door in. Claire was awake, sitting on her private balcony, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, watching the rain lash against the security lights. The first sound was the screech of tires on the wet asphalt outside the gates. Then the heavy, muffled thud of a vehicle colliding with the steel-reinforced barriers. Claire stood up, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. Below, the compound erupted into silent, lethal motion. Dark figures moved with tactical precision across the lawn. The security light snapped off, plunging the estate into pitch blackness. She retreated into her bedroom, her bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. She locked her door, a pathetic, useless gesture in a house built for war, and stood in the center of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. 10 minutes later, heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs. Someone pounded a fist against her bedroom door. Claire! It was Arthur. His voice was completely stripped of its usual stoic calm. It was tight, desperate. Claire unlocked the door and pulled it open. Arthur stood in the hallway, his jacket soaked through with rain and something darker, thicker. He was out of breath. Downstairs, now, he ordered. What happened? Is it Colin? She demanded, panic spiking in her throat. Colin is asleep. The west wing is secured. Arthur grabbed her forearm, his grip bruising. It's Valenti. He dragged her down the stairs and into the massive, pristine kitchen. The heavy curtains were drawn tight. The overhead fluorescent pendant lights were blazing, turning the marble island into an improvised operating theater. Valenti was slumped against the kitchen cabinets. His white dress shirt was ruined, entirely saturated with dark arterial blood on the left side of his abdomen. 2 guards were frantically pressing thick, white towels against his side, but the fabric was already soaking through. Valenti's head was thrown back against the wood, his face the color of wet ash. "He took 2 rounds in the lower left quadrant," Arthur said rapidly, pushing Claire toward him. "Small caliber, close range. It was an ambush at the docks." "Call an ambulance," Claire shouted, her medical training instantly overriding her terror. "He needs a trauma center, Arthur. He needs a surgeon." "No hospitals," Valenti grunted. His eyes fluttered open. The flat gray was clouded with pain, but his voice was violently absolute. "No cops, no records. The Colombians made a move. If they know I'm bleeding out in an ER, they'll hit this house tonight. They'll kill the boy." "You're going to bleed out on this linoleum if I don't get you to a hospital," Claire yelled back, dropping to her knees beside him. "Then fix me here," Valenti gasped, his hand gripping her wrist with terrifying strength. "You're a triage nurse. Fix it." "I patch people up until the surgeon arrives. I don't perform abdominal surgery on a kitchen counter." "Arthur," Valenti breathed, his eyes sliding shut again. "The bag." Arthur kicked a heavy black duffel bag across the floor. It hit Claire's knees. She unzipped it. It wasn't a standard first aid kit. It was a black market trauma bag. Suture kits, hemostatic gauze, surgical clamps, bags of saline, IV tubing, and vials of lidocaine. It was everything a field medic would need in a war zone. Claire stared at the tools. Then she looked at the pool of blood expanding across the white floor tiles. If he died, she was untethered. She was a ghost with no protector, trapped in a house full of armed men who owed her nothing. If he died, Colin went into the system. She took a deep breath. The panic receded, shoved down into a locked box in her mind. The triage nurse took over. "Get him on the island," she ordered Arthur, her voice dropping into a flat, authoritative clip. "Clear the counter. Wash your hands. I need you to hold pressure while I clean the wound." They hauled Valenti onto the cold marble. He groaned, a raw, guttural sound, but he didn't fight them. Claire snapped on a pair of latex gloves from the bag. She grabbed a pair of trauma shears and cut his ruined shirt away, exposing the pale, muscular expanse of his chest and abdomen. He was littered with scars, old knife wounds, burn marks, the puckered flesh of past bullet holes. This wasn't a man who directed violence from afar. This was a man who had been built by it. "Hold him down," Claire told Arthur. She grabbed a bottle of iodine and splashed it directly over the bullet holes. Valenti arched off the marble, a hiss of pure agony tearing through his teeth. "Sorry," she muttered, though her tone lacked any real apology. She grabbed a surgical probe. "I have to find the bullets. If they hit the bowel, you're dead. If they hit an artery, you're dead." "Just dig," Valenti ground out, his jaw clenched so hard she thought his teeth might shatter. For 30 minutes, the kitchen was silent, except for the harsh, ragged breathing of the men and the metallic click of surgical instruments. Claire worked with a cold, terrifying efficiency. The first bullet had passed clean through his side, missing the major organs by a fraction of an inch. The second was lodged shallowly against his lower rib. She didn't use the lidocaine. There was no time to wait for it to take effect, and the adrenaline in his system would render it mostly useless anyway. She clamped the bleeder, extracted the mangled lead, and began packing the wound with hemostatic gauze to force the clotting. She was covered in his blood. It was on her hands, her forearms, soaking the front of her nightgown. When she finally pulled the last suture tight and taped down a heavy gauze pad, she stepped back. Her hands were shaking so violently she dropped the needle drivers on the floor. Valenti was pale, drenched in sweat, but his breathing had leveled out. He turned his head slowly, looking at her. He saw the blood on her clothes. He saw the tremor in her hands. "Arthur," Valenti whispered. "Get out." Arthur hesitated, looking at the bloody scene, then nodded and retreated into the hallway, pulling the door shut behind him. The silence in the kitchen rushed back in. The hum of the heavy-duty refrigerator suddenly sounded deafening. Claire moved to the sink. She turned on the hot water and scrubbed her hands with dish soap, watching Valenti's blood swirl down the stainless steel drain. "You're good at that," Valenti said quietly from the counter. His voice was weak, stripped of its usual commanding baritone. "I'm a nurse," Claire said, shutting off the water. She gripped the edge of the sink, keeping her back to him. "It's what I do. You saved my life. I secured my investment," she shot back, her voice shaking with residual adrenaline and sudden, blinding anger. She turned around to face him. "Do not romanticize this. You brought a war to the front door where your 5-year-old nephew is sleeping. You made me tear into your flesh without anesthesia because you're too busy playing kingpin to go to a real hospital." Valenti didn't get angry. He just watched her, his expression utterly exposed in the harsh fluorescent light. "I do what I do," Valenti said, every word a deliberate, painful effort, "so that Colin never has to look over his shoulder. The people who hit me tonight, they were the same crew that paid off the drunk driver who killed my brother." Claire froze. The breath hitched in her throat. "It wasn't an accident?" "In my world, there are no accidents." Valenti closed his eyes. "I am building a wall around that boy, a wall of money, of fear, of absolute violence, so that by the time he is 18, no one will ever dare look at him twice. I am a monster, Claire, but I am the monster that keeps the wolves away from his door." He opened his eyes and looked at her. There was no threat in his gaze now. There was only exhaustion. "And you," he added softly, "are the only clean thing in this house." Claire stood in the center of the bloody kitchen, staring at the ruthless, bleeding man on the counter. The contract between them felt suddenly, terrifyingly inadequate to contain what was happening in this room. She had walked in a hostage. But looking at Valenti Hayes now, vulnerable, broken, and violently protective, she realized she was becoming something much more dangerous. She was becoming his lifeline. Valenti Hayes did not make a good patient. For the first 4 days following the shooting, a high-grade fever kept him anchored to the massive bed in the West Wing. He sweat through the heavy linen sheets. He hallucinated in fractured, violent bursts, shouting names of dead men and issuing orders to an empty room. Claire stayed with him. She slept in a leather armchair positioned near the door, waking every 2 hours to check his vitals, push oral antibiotics, and change the soaked dressings. She didn't do it out of affection. She told herself she did it for the same reason a mechanic maintains an engine. Valenti was the engine that kept the walls of the compound standing. If he failed, the wolves would tear through the drywall. On the 5th day, the fever broke. The frantic, delirious energy drained out of him, leaving a hollowed-out, exhausted man staring at the ceiling. Claire walked into the room carrying a stainless steel tray, holding a basin of warm water fresh gauze, and a bottle of medical-grade saline. She set it on the nightstand. Valenti turned his head. His eyes were clear, the flat gray returning, but the sharp edges of his authority were blunted by sheer physical weakness. "You look terrible," he rasped, his voice raw. "I've been playing night nurse to a stubborn cartel boss who refuses IV hydration," Claire replied flatly. She snapped on a pair of blue latex gloves. "Sit up. I need to clean the tracks." Valenti gritted his teeth and pushed himself up against the headboard. His breath hissed through his teeth as the torn abdominal muscles protested. He didn't complain. He just endured it. Claire peeled back the heavy surgical tape. The wound was ugly, a jagged, puckered tunnel of bruised flesh. But the edges were pink and clean. No necrosis, no infection. She soaked a square of gauze in saline and began to meticulously wipe away the dried blood. They were inches apart. The forced intimacy of the medical care stripped away the cold, businesslike dynamic they usually maintained. She could feel the heat radiating off his skin. She could see the faint, silvery lines of older scars weaving through his tattoos. "The one on your shoulder," Claire said, quietly, focused on the task. "Looks like a burn." Valenti looked down at his own chest, then at her. "Cigar. I was 19. I messed up a collection in the North End. The man I worked for wanted to make sure I remembered the exact cost of a mistake." "Did you?" "I remembered," Valenti said smoothly. "And 10 years later, I made sure he forgot how to breathe." Claire paused, the wet gauze hovering over his skin. She looked up at his face. He wasn't bragging. He stated it with the same casual detachment someone else might use to describe paying off a mortgage. It was a transaction. She pressed the fresh gauze against his side and taped it down. "You deal in ledgers, Valenti. Everything is a debt or a payment. Is Colin a debt or a payment?" Valenti's jaw tightened. "Colin is blood. Blood supersedes the ledger." The bedroom door creaked open. The sound was so faint, Claire almost missed it. They both turned. Colin stood in the doorway. He was wearing mismatched pajamas, clutching the wooden locomotive to his chest. He stared at the massive, imposing bed, his wide eyes fixing on the bandages wrapped tightly around his uncle's torso. Valenti froze. The ruthless syndicate boss vanished, replaced by a man terrified of breaking something fragile. He looked at Claire, a silent, desperate plea in his eyes. "What do I do?" Claire pulled her gloves off and dropped them on the tray. She stepped back, giving the boy an unobstructed view. "It's okay, Colin," Claire said, keeping her voice low and even. "He fell down and got a big scrape, but I patched it up. He's just resting." Colin didn't move for a long minute. Then slowly, he crossed the expanse of the hardwood floor. He stopped at the edge of the mattress. He looked at Valenti's pale face, then down at the wooden train in his hands. With a shaky exhale, Colin reached out and placed the locomotive on the edge of the mattress, right next to Valenti's hand. It was an offering. Valenti stared at the small wooden toy. His throat worked, visibly. He didn't reach out to touch Colin. He knew better than to push. But he slowly slid his large, rough hand over the train, covering it completely. "Thank you," Valenti whispered. His voice broke on the second syllable. Colin didn't speak. He just gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, turned around, and padded back out of the room. The silence in the bedroom was heavy, thick with things unsaid. Claire picked up the stainless steel tray. When she looked back at Valenti, he was staring at the doorway, his hand still resting over the toy train. A single silent tear tracked down the rugged topography of his face, catching in the dark stubble on his jaw. He didn't wipe it away, and Claire pretended not to see it. But in that quiet, sterile room, the terms of their arrangement fundamentally shifted. She was no longer just the woman keeping his secret. She was the woman keeping his family alive. 6 weeks passed. The winter deep froze the city, encasing the compound's sprawling lawns in a hard, glittering layer of frost. Valenti healed. He moved stiffly, and a faint limp lingered in his step when the damp cold seeped into his bones, but his grip on his empire tightened. The men who had ambushed him at the docks were systematically dismantled. Claire didn't ask questions. She just noticed the brief, violent headlines on the local news and the way Arthur's knuckles were constantly bruised. The home study concluded successfully. The state formally granted Valenti full guardianship of Colin, primarily citing the stabilizing maternal presence of Mrs. Hayes. They had won. The contract was fulfilled. The 3-year countdown had officially begun. It happened on a Tuesday. A quiet, unremarkable Tuesday. Claire was in the kitchen at 2 p.m, pouring a glass of apple juice for Colin, who was sitting at the island drawing a surprisingly accurate picture of the compound's guard dogs. Valenti was in his study with Arthur, the heavy oak doors shut tight against the world. The silence shattered with the deafening shriek of the perimeter alarm. It wasn't a muffled siren. It was a bone-rattling, high-decibel klaxon designed to disorient attackers and wake the dead. Claire dropped the juice box. It exploded on the linoleum, a yellow puddle spreading rapidly. Colin clamped his hands over his ears, his face twisting in terror, a silent scream tearing his mouth open. "Colin!" Claire lunged across the kitchen, hauling the boy out of the high chair. She crushed him to her chest. Gunfire erupted outside. Not the pop-pop of handguns, but the heavy rhythmic thud of automatic weapons tearing through wood and glass. The heavy kitchen doors burst open. Arthur slid into the room, his jacket off, a heavy black rifle in his hands. Blood was trickling down the side of his neck from a shattered window pane. "It's an internal breach," Arthur barked, his eyes scanning the room. "One of the new perimeter guys took a bribe. Navarro's crew is inside the gates. They're trying to breach the south entrance." "Where is Valenti?" Claire demanded, her voice cutting through the alarm. "Securing the study vault. He's coming." Arthur shoved a heavy, matte black handgun across the marble island. It skidded to a halt near the spilled juice. "Take the boy to the panic room in the basement, now. Do not stop. Do not open the door until I give you the code word." "I don't know how to use that," Claire said, staring at the gun. "Point it at the door and pull the trigger," Arthur growled. "Go!" Claire grabbed the heavy weapon. It felt completely alien in her hand, cold and dense. She hitched Colin higher on her hip. The boy was trembling so violently she could feel it vibrating through her own ribs. She ran. She bypassed the main hallway, taking the narrow servants' corridor that led to the basement stairs. The house was a war zone. The air smelled of cordite and pulverized drywall. She could hear men shouting in Spanish, the heavy thud of boots on the marble floors above her. They reached the basement door. Claire fumbled with the handle, her slick hands slipping on the brass. She threw it open and plunged into the dark stairwell. a shadow moved at the bottom of the stairs. Claire froze. A man stepped into the dim light of the emergency bulbs. He wasn't one of Valenti's guards. He wore a heavy tactical vest over a street jacket, a submachine gun slung casually across his chest. He looked up, spotting Claire and the boy on the landing. He didn't shout, he just smiled, a cold, empty expression, and raised the barrel of his weapon. Time dilated. The frantic hammering of Claire's heart seemed to slow, pushing against her eardrums. She saw the man's finger tightening on the trigger. She felt Colin's small fingers digging into her collarbone. She didn't think about her triage training. She didn't think about the fake marriage, or the fake name, or the dead woman she used to be. She thought about the wooden train on the mattress. She thought about the boy in her arms who had already seen his mother bleed to death on an asphalt road. Claire raised the handgun. She didn't aim down the sights. She just pointed the heavy steel block at the center of the man's chest and squeezed the trigger. The recoil was brutal. It snapped her wrist back, the deafening crack of the gunshot amplifying in the tight concrete stairwell. The man jerked backward as if kicked by a mule. The submachine gun fired a wild burst into the ceiling, raining plaster down on them, before he collapsed backward onto the basement floor, a dark, expanding stain ruining the front of his vest. Claire stood paralyzed on the landing, her ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. The smell of copper and sulfur filled her lungs. She stared at the body. Footsteps slammed down the hallway behind her. Claire whirled around, raising the gun again, her finger hovering over the trigger, her vision swimming with adrenaline. "Claire, drop it!" Valenti stood at the top of the stairs. He held a shotgun in his right hand. His face was smeared with dust, his white shirt torn. He looked past her, his eyes locking onto the dead man at the bottom of the stairs. He looked back at Claire. He saw the gun shaking in her hand. He saw the fierce, terrifying, feral protection in her eyes as she shielded Colin with her own body. "He's dead," Valenti said softly, his voice cutting through the ringing in her ears. He slowly lowered his shotgun. "It's over. Arthur cleared the foyer. The police are coming." Claire lowered the gun. Her knees gave out. She slumped against the plaster wall, sliding down to sit on the cold wooden stairs, pulling Colin onto her lap. The boy buried his face in her neck, his silent tears soaking her collar. Valenti walked down the stairs. He stepped over the dead man without a glance. He sat down on the step next to Claire. He didn't say a word. He just reached out, took the heavy handgun from her trembling fingers, set it on the floor, and wrapped his arm heavily around her shoulders. She leaned into him. The cartel boss and the triage nurse, covered in dust and blood, sitting in the stairwell of a mansion built on violence, anchoring each other to the earth. The cleanup was as brutally efficient as the violence had been. Before the local police arrived, the bodies were removed. The shattered glass was swept away. The blood was bleached from the floors. When the flashing red and blue lights finally cut through the winter darkness, they found the compound of a wealthy businessman who had been the victim of a targeted, but ultimately unsuccessful, home invasion. Valenti's lawyers handled the detectives. They provided a sanitized narrative of a security breach. Claire gave a quiet, trembling statement to an officer about hiding in the basement. It wasn't entirely a lie. She just omitted the part where she executed a man on the stairs. 3 days later, the house was quiet again. Claire stood on her balcony. The winter air was sharp and biting. She wore a heavy cashmere sweater, a cup of black coffee warming her hands. She looked out at the repaired security gates, watching a new rotation of guards patrolling the perimeter. She felt different. The ghost of Nora Fisher had finally, entirely burned away in the flash of that muzzle velocity. She didn't feel like a hostage anymore. She felt like a pillar holding up a very dark, very heavy roof. The balcony door opened. Valenti stepped out into the cold. He wore a dark suit, immaculate and razor sharp, ready for a meeting in the city to solidify the destruction of the men who had attacked them. He walked up to the railing and stood beside her. He didn't look at her. He looked out at the trees. "The adoption papers were finalized this morning," Valenti said quietly, his voice carried in the frigid air. "Colin is legally mine, legally ours." "I know," Claire said. Valenti reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a thick manila envelope and placed it on the small metal patio table between them. "There are new papers in there," Valenti said. "A new passport, a new social security number, a new name, a bank account in Switzerland with $3 million in it, no strings, no tracking." Claire looked at the envelope. She didn't touch it. "I told you I needed insurance to make sure you wouldn't run when things got hard," Valenti continued, his gray eyes finally turning to her. They were devoid of their usual calculation. They were entirely open. "You proved me wrong. You didn't run. You stood your ground. You protected my blood with your own hands. The debt is paid, Claire. The contract is void. If you want to walk away, if you want to leave this violence behind, you can take that envelope and walk out the front gates today. I will never look for you." Claire stared at the envelope. $3 million. Total freedom. She could go anywhere. She could be anyone. She could escape the guards, the guns, the constant, suffocating paranoia of Valenti Hayes' world. She thought about Colin, sitting downstairs in the kitchen, eating cereal and watching cartoons. She thought about the way Valenti had held her in the stairwell, his heart beating a steady, relentless rhythm against her shoulder. She reached out. Her fingers brushed the heavy manila paper. Then she picked it up, turned, and dropped it into the small decorative fire pit burning on the corner of the balcony. Valenti went entirely still. He watched the flames lick the edges of the envelope, curling the paper, consuming the fake passports and the bank codes. "You're burning your exit," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I don't need an exit," Claire said. She turned to face him. She didn't smile, but her eyes were fiercely clear. "I told you, Valenti, I'm accustomed to crisis, and I don't abandon my patients when they're still bleeding." Valenti stepped closer. The space between them evaporated. He looked down at her, the mask of the syndicate boss slipping completely, revealing the desperate, devoted man beneath it. "This world will consume you, Claire," he warned softly. "Let it try," she replied. Valenti reached up, his rough fingers tracing the line of her jaw. It wasn't the cold, possessive touch of a captor. It was the heavy, reverent touch of a man who had just realized he wasn't alone in the dark anymore. He leaned down, and when his mouth met hers, it tasted like bitter coffee, cold winter air, and absolute, undeniable permanence. They weren't pretending anymore. If you made it to the end of this twisted, dark romance, you know exactly how heavy that final choice was. Did Claire make the right decision staying with a mafia boss to protect the family? Or should she have taken the money and run? Let me know your unfiltered thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this deep dive into the gritty, emotional world of Valenti and Claire, smash that like button, share this story with your fellow romance addicts, and hit subscribe with notifications on. I've got more intense, character-driven storytelling coming your way every single week. Don't miss it.